It's a great challenge. Thanks so much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. May I bring the proceedings to a start? I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the Danube Institute. My name is John O'Sullivan, I'm its president. I won't say any more about the Institute since I've now spoken a little item about it at every conference. I think most of you know what we do, and the fact that you're here suggests that you to some extent enjoy it. Well, you're also here, of course, in such large numbers because we have a most distinguished speaker and two distinguished respondents, and our audience today, of course, also includes a considerable number of members of the diplomatic corps, and I'm delighted to see the US ambassador here. Thank you for coming. Can I just then say that the reason I think you're here is, first of all, to hear one of the most distinguished politicians in today's world, one of those politicians who, political leaders who, in addition to performing the necessary role of political leaders, running an effective government, winning elections, has also managed to become more than that. Like, for example, Lee Kuan Yew in Asia, he has been somebody who has managed to make a mark on our world in a wider sense. Now, in part, that's because he ran a very successful government, which, for example, concluded free trade agreements with major economies like Japan, but also a government that took on one of the biggest problems, which afflicts, of course, Europe as well as Asia, and as well as particularly Australia, and that is what I would call uncontrolled or mass migration, which in the case of Australia was conducted overseas and by people taking boats and simply arriving in Australia. It was the general view in Australia for a long time that it was impossible to do anything about that, and the argument stopping the boats, which first John Howard and subsequently our principal guest tonight, Tony Abbott, became associated with and made election pledges to stop the boats in the course of the campaigns. It was said that this was an empty boast. It couldn't be done. And there were a lot of voters, presumably, who took that decision. But winning an election, well, first of all, holding the Labour Party from winning an expected victory in 2010, he subsequently won a major election. And he ran a successful government until party disputes led to his leaving. He managed, however, to remain one of the most important politicians in Australia, and now that he's no longer in Parliament, I think we can hope that he will play a bigger part in the world in general, particularly on this issue, but of course by no means confined to this issue. In fact, before coming to Budapest this week, he made a major, much reported, impactful speech in London on Brexit, and the British do need advice, I think, on Brexit. After our principal guest has spoken, we have two respondents, and they will conduct a conversation on the principal topic, migration, but also on other aspects of Australian politics and indeed over our world politics, particularly in Asia. The other two guests are two distinguished ambassadors, a former Hungarian ambassador to Australia, Gabor Csaba, and a former Australian ambassador to Hungary, Mark Higgy. After Tony Abbott has spoken, and I will retire now to let him do so, they will conduct a conversation between themselves. I will then at some point come up on the stage and open up that conversation to all of you, so that you can ask our principal guest, former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott questions, and I now invite him to address us.
Well, John, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here in beautiful Budapest. It's my first trip to beautiful Budapest. I'd been told that it was a magnificent city, and unusually it has lived up entirely to the wonderful expectations that were created. Can I say that I have discovered in just the last 24 hours how Budapest in particular, and Hungary perhaps more generally, has become a vibrant part of the intellectual life of the wider West. And I'm particularly pleased to see something of an English-speaking diaspora based now here in Budapest, making a considerable contribution to it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the working title for these remarks is "What Can Australia Teach Hungary on Border Protection?" In fact, Australia has very little to teach Hungary on border protection. In fact, no country has much to teach Hungary on border protection, but Australia does indeed have much to teach Europe on border protection, as does Hungary, which has provided Germany, France, Spain and Sweden, to name just some of the countries which have struggled with border protection. Hungary has provided them with an object lesson in how to handle it. So just as Australia has shown the world how to protect a maritime border, Hungary has shown the world how to protect a land border. So between our two countries, there's no end of a lesson for Europe, which has now been subject to what amounts to a peaceful invasion for about 4 years. Yes, because of the fence that Hungary erected in 2015 to stop the hundreds of thousands marching towards Germany, and because of policy changes to mimic Hungary's in some other Central and Eastern European countries, and because of deals that the EU has done with Turkey, that particular flood has become more like a trickle. But there are still many tens of thousands of people taking to small boats across the Mediterranean in the hope of a better life. Thousands are still drowning, but most are making it across, where they add immensely to the economic and the social problems of Europe. So there is a very clear objective. The people smuggling trade simply has to be stopped. To save lives, it simply has to be stopped. That's what Australia has shown the world how to do. That's what the countries of Europe could do if they were prepared to follow Australia's example. But to save lives in the short run and to save themselves in the long run, the countries of Europe would have to adopt some of Australia's attitudes, and Hungary's attitudes too, because you can't put effective border protection in place unless you first believe in yourselves enough to make border protection policies work. Yes, there are at least 4 million people who have been displaced by the war in Syria and Iraq, but only about half of the nearly 4 million people who've shoved their way into Europe over the past 4 years have come from war zones. In fact, they've converged on Europe from all over the Middle East, from Africa and from Central Asia, not because they were the victims of fighting, but because they believed that Europe was open to everyone, thanks to the German Chancellor's "we will cope" initial response to this human wave. Now, of course, a well-organised country of some 80 million people can cope with 1 million arrivals. The question is not, can it cope, but should it have to cope? That's the difference between Australia and Hungary on the one hand, and most of the countries of Europe on the other. Australia and Hungary are quite clear that being poor and being able to benefit from life in a rich country confers no right of entry. Most of the countries of Europe, though, are not so sure. They don't want people to arrive illegally by boat. They don't want people to cross borders illegally, but they're not sure that they have the moral right to stop them. There's no doubt that people in immediate fear of their lives should indeed be able to claim sanctuary. No doubt about that. Of course, civilians threatened by war should be able to cross a border and seek safety. But here's the point. There is an absolute world of moral difference between people who cross one border to be safe and people who cross multiple borders to have a better life. No one can blame them for wanting a better life, but no one has a duty to give it to them unconditionally and with no questions asked. A person who crosses one border to be safe is a refugee whom the host country has a duty to protect. But a person who crosses multiple borders for a better life is a would-be economic migrant whom the host country has every right to refuse. Australia and Hungary accept this, although unlike Hungary, Australia also has the world's largest refugee program on a per capita basis, and since stopping the illegal migrant boats has actually increased its intake of refugees who come the right way. But most importantly, Australia and Hungary haven't allowed rich country guilt to obscure their duty to their own citizens to maintain strict control of their borders in order to keep their country's character. Make no mistake, a rich country that takes the view that anyone who can get here can stay here, even if it's 80 million strong, will eventually find that it can't cope with the numbers that have the inclination and the ability to come, especially when the newcomers are especially breaking in rather than joining in. We have to face facts here. Some of Turkey's leaders have urged Muslims to take back parts of Europe. And as Europe has discovered, among the would-be migrants are soldiers of the Caliphate, bent on mayhem. Many of those who have taken boats across the Mediterranean or clamoured at Europe's gates look set to join an angry underclass. Too many have come, not with gratitude, but with grievance and with the insistence that Europe should make way for them. Now, if it's allowed to continue unchecked over time, this could hardly not turn into an existential challenge, because thanks to better transport and greater knowledge online, there is virtually no limit to the numbers that could and might turn up on your doorstep if they think they will be welcomed. That's the key to controlling your border, the absolute key, the declaration that you have a right to do so, because it's only once you've done that and meant it that sensible measures can be adopted. And that's exactly what Australia did under my government. We stopped illegal boats at sea and we escorted them back to Indonesian waters. As well, we had arrangements with the governments of Sri Lanka and Vietnam to fly back anyone who had made the longer journey by boat from there. And if the boats were scuttled, we had big orange life rafts, really big orange life rafts on hand so that people could safely be returned to whence they'd come. I knew the risks to our personnel. I knew the strain this could put on relations with Indonesia. I knew the outcry it would spark from well-meaning people, but it simply had to be done. Effective border protection is not for the squeamish. It really isn't. But it's absolutely necessary to save lives and to preserve nations. That indeed is the truly compassionate thing to do, to stop the boats and to stop the deaths. Indeed, the only way to stop the deaths is to stop the boats. And for more than 5 years now, there have been almost no illegal arrivals by boat in Australia, and the drownings have totally stopped. Now, I know that Europe's challenges are on a larger scale and the geography is different. But with the right will and the right organisation, there is no reason why there could not be similar success and similar success quickly. What it needs is a conviction among the continent's leaders that stopping people smuggling, stopping deaths at sea, and protecting Europe's way of life is the right and the moral thing to do. You have to match the conviction of those demanding entry with the greater conviction that you have a right to say no. What's needed is an end to the self-doubt about the entitlement of European nations individually and collectively to stand up for themselves. Of course, Europe's navies must continue to do their humanitarian duty and rescue people who might otherwise drown. But subsequently taking them on to Spain, to Italy and to Greece, the destinations they were always making for, just guarantees that more will make this deadly journey. So long as people think that arriving in Europe means staying in Europe, they will keep coming. Sending them to more European countries won't solve the problem, it will just spread it around. So people in no immediate danger just have to be turned back at Europe's borders. People intercepted in the Mediterranean just have to be returned to their starting point. Again, I say, people smuggling can't be managed, it just has to be stopped. And if that means European naval personnel delivering people back onto the beaches of Libya, so be it. I recall the morning early in 2014, I saw a photograph all over the front page of Australia's biggest selling newspaper. It was an orange life raft washed up on an Indonesian beach. I knew then that we had the people smuggling trade beaten. Likewise, a photograph of European naval personnel putting people ashore, not in Italy or in Spain, but in Libya, would finally prove that these countries had rediscovered the will needed to say no to moral blackmail, because that's what this is. Foreigners saying to us that you've no right to stop us, and people in our midst agreeing that because we're relatively rich and they're relatively poor, we have to let them in. Now, perhaps the most unseemly part of this now drawn-out crisis has been the NGO flotillas cruising the Med, looking to rescue those in leaky boats and to take them safely to Europe. They claim to be good Samaritans, but they're actually just unpaid assistants to the people smuggling trade. What's more, they're confirming the moral entitlement of everyone getting on a boat in Africa or in Asia to a new life in Europe. They're effectively accessories to crime, and in Australia could probably be charged with people smuggling offences, but here in Europe they seem to be regarded as misguided do-gooders at worst. Then there's the pervasive reference to those would-be illegal immigrants as asylum seekers. They might be asking for asylum, but they're hardly ever entitled to it. The vast majority have deliberately chosen a course of action that's outside the law, and anything that tends to depict them as having little or no choice is misleading. It's even morally corrupting. It amounts to an attempt to condition, even to coerce our reaction by deliberately misdescribing what's actually happening. No doubt, many of the believers in open borders are good people who just want the right thing for those who are worse off. But it's hard not to detect a political agenda here. Those who most insist on letting everyone in must at some level want to force the changes on Europe and on other Western societies that uncontrolled migration will bring. Or they're at least indifferent to them because they think perhaps that these changes will only be noticed in someone else's neighbourhood. But at some level, they must want to see economies weakened, social cohesion reduced, and governments distracted, because you can't will the cause without also willing the effect. Now, of course, most would prefer not to acknowledge the downsides of uncontrolled immigration, but again, it's hard not to discern a deliberate stratagem to change the nature of European countries as much as to exhibit post-Christian compassion. If you'd concluded, for instance, that voters would never buy the nationalisation of the means of production, distribution and exchange, and would never support confiscatory levels of tax, maybe uncontrolled borders is a backdoor way to reducing the relative wealth of the West and increasing the relative wealth of the rest. Likewise, the high-sounding climate change policy that activists push on rich countries but never on developing ones like China and India is a very effective way to make rich countries poorer and poor countries richer. The old socialists couldn't win an economic argument for the equalisation of wealth within countries, so the new socialists are trying to win a moral argument for the equalisation of wealth between countries. With climate change, uncontrolled immigration has become the left's preferred way to weaken the strength and self-confidence of the West. And it's quite clever because they're appealing to our ideals rather than challenging our self-interest. In his powerful book on the immigration crisis, The Strange Death of Europe, Douglas Murray attributes the confusion of the elites and the paralysis of governments to a collapse of cultural self-confidence linked to the loss of Christian faith. There's no doubt that this is real, the loss of religious faith and even of religious knowledge. It's real in Australia, no less than in Western Europe, if perhaps less so in Eastern Europe. Yet at least one increasingly religion-free country, Australia, has brought the problem of illegal migration under control, even if we've not yet really tackled excessive legal migration. Now, all this suggests to me that countries that retain a strong sense of national pride, like Australia and the United States and the United Kingdom, as well as Hungary and the other newly free countries of Eastern Europe, are those most likely to keep their borders strong. Countries that kept their freedom or have won it back seem more inclined to defend their borders than those that have, in relatively recent times, surrendered their freedom or misused it. Perhaps there is a lesson here. Once you give some of your national freedom away and forfeit some of your national pride, you risk losing much, even of that you have left. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's wonderful to be here. My first trip to Budapest, but I certainly hope it won't be the last.
Yeah.
Tony, thank you very much indeed. I'd like, on behalf of everybody, to express our gratitude for a very powerful, economically expressed address. It was very fine and gives us a great deal to think about. So at this point, I'm going to again return to my seat in the stalls and throw the questioning open to Mark Higgy and to Gabor Chaba. Perhaps, Gabor, I could ask you to raise the first question in the conversation between the two of you, Antonio.
Okay, thank you very much. I think, Mark, you will address a lot of the specific issues related to this one. I would just broaden the horizon for a little bit, for a few minutes. Obviously, your country has benefited from the influx of people. That's part of Australia's success story. That's part of your character, national character. And this is certainly something that Australia has benefited from largely over the past several decades. Now, a decade ago, when Australians were asked in a poll whether the country's population should be enlarged or not, the majority said yes for the idea of actually continuing this process of taking a lot of people, not talking about illegal migrants, but generally speaking, migration, people coming in through the ways that you accept and you support. Recently, another poll was taken in which 2/3 of Australians rejected the idea of continuing this process. And this is actually very much in line with the government's policy of cutting the intake by 30,000 a year to actually, I think, 160,000 now annually. What is behind this change, in your opinion? How is Australian public opinion changing in this respect?
Okay, well, I want to make 2 points first. The first point is that in Australia we have got illegal migration stopped, but legal migration is proceeding at a very high level. And much of it is not really under the government's direct control. It's driven by universities recruiting overseas students and by businesses recruiting people on up to 4-year temporary visas. Now, anyone who comes to your country for more than a year is going to want a car, a house and a job. That means downward pressure on wages, upward pressure on housing prices and affordability, and clogged infrastructure and public transport. And with legal migration now running at record levels in Australia for more than a decade, running at 250,000 a year, that's a city the size of Canberra every 2 years coming in just through migration alone. Public support for migration has gone from being relatively strong and constant to being to evaporating fast, basically. In that sense, Australians are now almost as anxious about high levels of immigration as Europeans are, although I do take your fundamental point. Australia is an immigrant society in a way that most of the countries of Europe are not, and that gives us a predisposition, if you like, a folk memory, if you like, of being immigrants ourselves, so that in the right numbers and under the right circumstances, yes, we would readily go back to supporting immigration.
And I understand proportionately you take in more people than most other developed countries, except probably for Switzerland and Luxembourg.
On a per capita basis,
Yeah,
we take more than anyone else. I mean, America, I think, takes the most through legal UNHCR programs. They take about 100,000, I think. But at the moment, we're taking something like 25,000 a year, and we've got less than 10% of the population of the United States.
And actually, immigration is the primary driver of population growth, if my understanding is correct.
In all Western countries, as we will no doubt be hearing at the demography summit tomorrow, in all Western countries, population growth, if it's occurring, is only occurring through immigration, and increasingly the immigration is from third world countries, not from other first world countries.
Well, if you're finished for the moment, could I add to John's compliments about what a fine and powerful address that was, and I'd make the point that having been in Europe for most of the past 5 years or so, I've been struck by the increased impact of the Australian message, particularly as projected by your government, and interest in Australia's solutions for stopping this great scourge. I'd just add that one little misunderstanding that I often struck when I was in Brussels was people would say, oh, well, you know, Australia has managed this, but, you know, you're a long way away and the distances to reach Australia are sort of they're much more difficult than reaching Europe. And of course, Australia is much further, you know, is further away from Africa and the Middle East and most of the source countries for the migrants. But the main route, as you know only too well, Tony, between the southern coast of Java and Christmas Island is almost exactly the same as between Libya and Lampedusa. So in fact, the logistics for the people smugglers of getting the boats to our territory was remarkably similar to Europe. But what I was going to ask you, I mean, the timing of your address is terrific in the sense that we've had a particularly big developing story in Europe over the past week, and that is the change in the Italian government with Matteo Salvini, who's been astonishingly successful in stopping boats reaching Italian territory over the past year, and has been massively popular. He's out. The government is moving to the left, and you know, the widespread expectation is that means when you shift from centre right to left, that therefore this will mean bad news for strong borders. Now, I mean, in Australia, we have a situation where our left of centre party, the Labour Party, has signed on to government policies in this area. So, but I would have to say that a lot of Australians have grave reservations about the credibility of their position. So, I suppose the question I would ask is in terms of party political terms, are safe borders really only safe with Conservative governments, and can we always assume, unfortunately, that left of centre governments will be bad news for strong borders?
Okay, that's a very interesting point you make, Mark, and I should, by way of full disclosure, let all of you know that Mark was my foreign policy advisor for quite a few years. So perhaps we've learnt from each other. The hallmarks of the political left these days are not just the traditional fixation with higher taxes on the so-called rich. It's the climate cult and support for open borders. I mean, these are the three things that define the political left these days. Higher taxes on the so-called rich, the climate cult, and support for open borders. Now, I think that by contrast, parties of the centre-right are these days less characterised by the Reagan-Thatcher low-tax deregulation agenda. I mean, it's still important. Sound finance is still important. I mean, you can't spend what you haven't got. If governments can't raise the money responsibly, they can't really legitimately go on spending it. But more than ever before, I think parties of the centre-right have become the patriotic parties, the parties that put their country first, the parties that when it comes to a conflict between some supranational global institution like the EU or the UN, put their country first. And look, while I don't say that there's never anything at all to be said for global institutions, and I don't say that every country always gets it right, I do think by and large, deep in their hearts, the average voter is a patriot. The average voter respects, even loves, the culture and the country that has made him or her what he or she is. So I think parties of the centre-right have got a great political opportunity here, quite apart from actually having the merits of this particular issue.
Yeah, I mean it's curious on one level because of course compassion is one of the words, the favourite words of the left, and you'd think if you were compassionate, you'd worry about lots of people drowning trying to reach our shores, but that concern seems to have been trumped basically by a range of other concerns that the left cares more about.
That's right. The more dangerous it is, the more they blame not the people smugglers who've made it possible, but the people who are actually trying to stop the problem by stopping the people smuggling trade.
Absolutely. I wonder if I could turn to Brexit, and you've just spent a few days in London on that. Here, it's interesting, I find, to compare Hungary's attitude to the European project with that of Britain, and Hungary and the other members of the Visegrad group, in a different way, share British concerns about, if you like, EU overreach in terms of contraction of sovereignty. But of course, in the case of the Visegrad group, it's the attempt to impose rules from Brussels about sharing around of asylum seekers and so forth. I find it interesting to hear Hungary's strategy in relation to all of this, and of course there's a profound difference between what happened in Britain and the attitude here. The British view was, let's just get out, let's get out. This was a mistake. It involved sacrificing too much sovereignty, so the only solution is to leave. What our Hungarian friends say is, well, the EU has problems, there is overreach. It tries to do too much. Our solution is to change it, and we think that eventually there'll be enough dissident voices within the EU to do that. I mean, from your conversations in London about the EU and so forth, would you have any confidence that Hungary can be onto a winner with that sort of approach, or would you be more
okay, well, look, three points, Mark. The first point I make is that in recent years, most Britons have tended to see the EU as holding them back rather than helping them up. But, at least initially, I think most Hungarians saw the EU as helping them up rather than holding them back after the Soviet era. So that's the first point. Second point I make is that from my discussions in Hungary today, and you can't be too dogmatic based on a day's conversations, but my read of the Hungarian view is that they understand why the British want to get out, but they would prefer that they didn't, because the British were their principal ally within the councils of Europe.
Yes.
Third point, and this is the critical one, I don't think the EU is capable of reform. I mean, David Cameron tried very, very hard to ask for perfectly reasonable reforms from the EU and perfectly reasonable concessions from the EU for Britain. And David Cameron, as we all know, is a reasonable man. He is a decent man. He is not a firebrand. He is not a tub-thumping nationalist. And they humiliated him. They absolutely humiliated this wonderfully responsible and decent British Prime Minister making a reasonable request. Even though they must have known that by humiliating him, they would make it much more likely that Britain would leave and disrupt the whole European project. I just think there is a mulishness in the councils of the EU that makes it almost impossible for them to give anything.
Yeah. I was in Brussels when the referendum took place, and the assumption which everyone had, the EU institutions, Brits, was that there would be Britain would leave with some kind of deal. The talk was Canada plus or Norway minus, and this seemed a statement of the obvious, given that 44% of British exports go to the rest of the EU. But we do seem to have got to a situation where there is a very high prospect of a departure with no deal. What sort of sense did you get in London about that?
Well, look, obviously it's a fast-moving situation in the House of Commons at this present time, and it could have changed even in the hour or so since I last looked at my smartphone. My sense is that the EU will never offer Britain a good deal as long as they think there's a chance that they might sabotage the whole Brexit project. So I think Britain must be prepared to leave with no deal, must be prepared to leave with no deal. If they're not prepared to leave with no deal, they might find themselves humiliatingly chained to the EU indefinitely. And for a country which has been as successful and proud and patriotic as Britain, to find itself in that shocking situation, this would be a national defeat on an epic scale that would echo down the ages. It would suggest to me that the Britain we all thought we knew is not what it was. If it allows itself to be bluffed by the EU, the bullies of the EU, into staying in Europe on such humiliating terms.
As John mentioned, your government was extremely successful.
I hope the BBC got that, did they?
Your government was extremely successul finalising a number of big trade deals with key partners. Earlier Australian governments had completed other agreements as well. I mean, Australia is in a good situation when it comes to our international trade. if Britain leaves without a deal, it will start with nothing. Is that, do you think, something we should worry about for Britain?
Well, I can understand why British people would prefer to leave with a deal, provided it's a good deal.
Yeah.
Of course you'd prefer to leave with a good deal than with no deal. But as I said, I think the prospect of getting a good deal out of the EU is almost non-existent, particularly with the attempts by some misguided members of the British establishment to subvert the democratic will as expressed in the referendum. So, but let me remind everyone of this. Britain already does 55% of its trade with the rest of the world on a no-deal basis. British trade done on a no-deal basis with the rest of the world is growing, whereas British trade done within the EU is actually shrinking. The more dynamic parts of the world's economy are not in the EU, they are elsewhere. Australia does $100 billion worth of trade with the EU every year on a no-deal basis. So you can successfully trade with the world without a deal, and you can successfully trade with Europe without a deal. They're the two things that I think people need to know. Now, obviously, depending upon how the French decide to behave at Calais, if there is a no-deal Brexit, there could be delays at airports, delays at wharves, disruption. Yes, there could be that, but let's remember there was plenty of disruption at airports in the 6 to 12 months after September the 11th. We all coped, and now there's more global aviation than ever before, and likewise, Britain will cope. In the long run, Europe has more to lose from a disorderly Brexit than Britain does.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ireland, I don't think, would be very enthusiastic about setting up border posts on the border with Northern Ireland.
Well, if, as I imagine, a post-Brexit Britain starts with the assumption that trade from Europe will be entirely free of tariffs and quotas, and that there will be full mutual recognition of standards and credentials, there's no reason for Britain to establish a hard border. I mean, there are already differences north of the border to south of the border, different tax rates, different currency, different regulations. They can cope with that without a hard border, so I'm sure they can cope with a few more differences if that's what happens.
Gabor, I think you wanted to move into some wider areas.
Taking advantage of this precious opportunity you are here, it's so rare that we have someone, such a leading representative of Australia. I think we should keep reminding ourselves that we have some very strong friends down under, people who share our values, who share many of the assessments of what's going on in the world. And have a very special vantage point from which to look at Asia, which is obviously in the center of attention for everyone these days, this being the Asian century. Now, across the Australian political elite, political class, and the public, there has been a conviction that your country's security primarily rests on the alliance that you have had with the United States.
Yes.
At the same time, China has emerged as your biggest trading partner, also the biggest export market for Australian minerals and energy. And certainly there is this competition going on in the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific, as we now increasingly refer to the region. What is Australia's take on this situation? This is a shifting regional chessboard on which you are supposed to find your place and achieve your security. How do you do it? What is the scenario for which you would subscribe?
Well, you've asked a very difficult question to which there is no simple answer, and to which the answer probably changes from month to month. John Howard used to say, this was his phrase, when asked about Australia, China and America, he said, "You do not have to choose between your history and geography." My phrase, when confronting the same question, was, "You do not make new friends by dumping old ones." Now, China is now our largest trading partner. America remains, and I believe I hope will always remain, our principal strategic partner. And what we might once have comfortingly assumed was convergence between China and America as China got more wealthy, we assumed it would get more liberal. Plainly is no longer the case. So instead of convergence, there is now divergence. It's not easy, and many in Australia worry that in the event of increasing conflict, tension between China and America, our friendship with America, our overriding strategic partnership with America, could mean that China might decide to turn off the tap on our minerals. Now, this is a beguiling but a superficial argument, because iron ore and coal are, even natural gas, they're fungible. And if China decides to buy more iron ore from Brazil or more coal from Indonesia, that will go from some countries to China, and those countries that are no longer getting Indonesian coal and Brazilian iron ore can just get it from us. So I don't think the threat to turn off the trade tap is really as serious as some people fear. I think the challenge is to try to ensure that China is not so integrated in the supply chain that it can paralyse our commerce. I think that's the integration in the supply chain is more of a challenge than simply having China as a major trading partner. And I think in his own way, that's what President Trump is now trying to address.
During my time as ambassador in Canberra, there was a very interesting phenomenon. Chinese companies, many of them government-controlled, trying to invest in Australia, and especially in what you can call strategic sectors, mining and energy. Chinalco's case is obviously one of the best-known ones, which tried to increase its ownership share in Rio Tinto, your mining giant. This is certainly a disturbing phenomenon, in addition to some other things like muscle flexing and cyber attacks and the rest of it. How do you think Australia should respond to these challenges?
Okay, and look, it was easier to feel relatively relaxed about Chinese investment when China appeared to be liberalising than it is when China obviously is not liberalising and is becoming more assertive in every sense. I think a very good rule of thumb with investment from China is to say, we will only allow you to invest in our country in ways that you would allow us to invest in your country. And given that no Australian investment in Chinese infrastructure, utilities, telecommunications, media, any agents of influence, areas of influence would be permitted, I think that might be quite a good rule of thumb to be adopted by us in the future.
Indonesia has been becoming a more and more significant player in the region, and certainly, with the strategic, the great power competition intensifying in the region, its geostrategic importance is also bound to grow. This is certainly a partner with which you have to deal, and certainly you are best advised to have a good relationship with Indonesia. Still, my understanding is that Australian-Indonesian relationship has been fraught with certain suspicions and ambivalence, some grievances. What do you think should be the place of Indonesia in your foreign policy strategy?
Okay, well, there's a sense in which no country is more important to Australia than Indonesia, because no country practically could cause more difficulties for us than Indonesia. Again, I used to say that we have stronger economic relationships, we have stronger cultural and historical relationships, we have stronger strategic relationships, but in some ways, no relationship is more important to us than that with Indonesia. And I declared that the first visit that any Australian Prime Minister should make abroad should be to Indonesia as a mark of the importance that we place on that particular relationship. Now, there's no doubt that the relationship has waxed and waned. I think, you might correct me here if I've got it wrong, Mark, but I think Australia was the first country to recognise Indonesia as independent as a result of the the war against the Dutch.
Yeah.
And we had good relations initially. That tended to sour, and in fact there was Australian military forces were in action against Indonesians in the period of Indonesia's confrontation with Malaya. And then, of course, John Howard and SBY had a wonderful relationship, which was, in some measure at least, cemented by Australia's open-hearted response to help Indonesia with $1 billion worth of aid after the East Asian tsunami, or the Indian Ocean tsunami of Christmas 2004. And then we cooperated extremely well with Indonesia in response to various terrorist attacks on Australian citizens in that period as well. People smuggling was a problem because the Indonesians regarded cracking down on people smuggling as a fourth order issue, whereas for us it was a first order issue, and they got quite irritated with us when we constantly expected them to do more. So look, the relationship has its better moments and its not so good moments, but I think over time the relationship is getting better. Lots of Australians go to Bali several times a year. There's probably millions of Australians who now regard Bali as a kind of second home. I'm not sure that they always behave in an exemplary fashion, but nevertheless there is inevitably a fair bit of interaction. So look, it's a challenge, but I think we're very well aware of it, and I think we are managing it pretty well under all the circumstances.
Knowing that there will be a lot of questions from the floor, let me just use our prerogative for one more question. European diplomats serving down under are on what we consider a noble quest to make Europe and the EU more visible and more attractive to Australians. And really, there is a lot that connects us, common values, a massive investment relationship, really a lot of things that make this relationship viable and vibrant. Still, despite all the results of the past several decades, and let me just also go back to the idea that free trade talks now started, and this is, I think, a laudable initiative. That is something that one could call a strategic dimension in this relationship between the European Union and Australia. My first question is, where do you see this relationship going? Actually, where do you think that it would make sense for the European Union and Australia to do more in the world, actually, to achieve positive results? And second, probably a more sensitive or more difficult issue, how do you see us Europeans in Australia these days, in the early years of this century? So what is the overall picture of this old continent to which you are connected in so many ways, people-to-people contact, ties, historical ties? What do you see in us right now?
Okay, well, I think Australia has nothing but goodwill for the people and the countries of Europe. And let's face it, we are an immigrant nation, and there is not a country of Europe that hasn't sent large numbers of people to Australia one way or another. The Poms, of course, often came in chains, but everyone else came as a free settler, including the Hungarians who arrived in very large numbers after the 1956 atrocity. So nothing but goodwill towards the people and the countries of Europe. Great affection for most of the peoples of Europe. I think we regard the EU a little differently, though. I mean, how long did Canada take to get a free trade deal of sorts with the EU, despite the fact that you'd think the French would have been barracking for that deal because of the position of the Quebecois. It took years and years.
8 years.
And then, having finalised it, it then took more years and years to actually implement it because there were different last-ditch rearguard actions by different sectional interests around the continent. And the other problem is the EU has no armed force. I mean, how can you take seriously an entity that has no armed force? And for all their enthusiasm for the EU, I can't see the French surrendering control of their armed forces to the European Union. No country of Europe will surrender control of its armed forces to the EU, and no country should surrender control of its armed forces to the EU. And until the EU can deploy a military force in the same way that the United States or the United Kingdom or France could deploy a military force, it's very hard to take the EU seriously as a strategic partner. However, it doesn't matter how many conferences the EU turns up. Very hard to take them seriously if they've got no armed forces at their command.
The EU, of course, says, well, it might take 8 years to reach a free trade agreement with Canada, but then access to 500 million people, you know, and but yes, it does take a long
but
time.
We're doing $100 billion worth of trade a year already with the EU.
And this is one of the things that's fed into the Brexit debate. I mean, at the moment, the EU has...
and the EU is telling us that we have to change the name of all of our cheese, and we can't call the wine what we call it.
I mean, the EU has been an underperformer when it comes to
that was
free
a good
free
thing
trade.
when it came to Tokai, but that's a separate issue.
I mean, Korea and Canada are the only developed countries that the EU has free trade deals with after all this time. But yes, despite your reservations, the Abbott government did launch free trade talks with the European Union.
That's because you were the ambassador, Mark, and we knew that if there was anyone that could pull it off, it was the magician, Mark.
Still hasn't happened, but
no.
For you. But I was going to ask a follow-up to what Gobble was talking about China and the US in the Pacific. I mean, a number of our academic strategic thinkers are very fond of predicting a US withdrawal from the Pacific and talk about a sort of lack of interest and so forth. In many ways, in a similar way that they often forecast that President Trump isn't interested in NATO anymore, which is wrong. I mean, I must say my impression is that US interest in our part of the world is just as strong as ever, as highlighted by the increasing US presence in the north of Australia and so forth. What's your sense, Tony?
Look, there is no doubt that President Trump's rhetoric is quite different from that of his predecessors. But I think probably the best speech he's given was the speech he gave in Warsaw a year or so back, talking about the heroism of the Polish people. So look, I think there is absolutely no doubt that under President Trump, the Americans will be much more insistent on other countries pulling their weight. But frankly, other countries should pull their weight more. I mean, none of us have, we've all free-ridden on America for our security for a long, long time. And as America's economic heft slowly declines vis-a-vis the rest of the world, I think it is absolutely essential that the rest of us rise to the challenge.
Thank you very much. And perhaps at this point I can invite questions from the floor, but before I take one, I'd like to actually take the privilege of asking the first one myself, because I would like to raise the question of Hong Kong. It's obviously what's happening between China and Hong Kong is a great problem for all of the Western countries, because on the one hand, we feel tremendous sympathy and admiration for the courage of the citizens of Hong Kong. On the other hand, of course, we want to continue as far as possible to have good relations with the Chinese, and not every aspect of the people of Hong Kong, their behaviour has been absolutely ideal. The riot that began the matter with invading the Legislative Council and so on, obviously was a bit disturbing. So is there some proposal, do you think, that could be put together by different countries, different Western countries, to try to achieve a better result for the people of Hong Kong than seems likely if we simply do nothing on the sidelines?
It's a very good question, John, and I'm not in government anymore. I assume that there would be reasonably high-level dialogue between, for argument's sake, the Five Eyes partners on this very issue. If the Chinese do crack down in Hong Kong, if there is anything remotely approaching a Tiananmen Square style situation that develops in Hong Kong, that would be disastrous for the people of Hong Kong. It would be for the people of Hong Kong who I think have been heroic, absolutely heroic, in seeking not just a better life, but a freer life. I mean, this is not about economic self-interest. I mean, they are already very wealthy compared to the people of China. This is almost a moral campaign on their part, and I think for that reason it's almost entirely admirable, notwithstanding some people going too far in a couple of instances. So look, if the Chinese do crack down, I think there should be a strong response, preferably a collective response, but if it can't be collective, I hope individual countries would take a strong response. I think that the sort of sanctions that have been applied against key people in the Russian establishment in response to bad behaviour by Russia in the Ukraine and elsewhere might provide a model for the sort of response that could be applied against China if China has plainly departed from the letter and spirit of the one country, two systems agreement that it made with Britain. I mean, let's face it, any number of senior leaders in China have got their kids studying at Harvard, at Oxford, even at Sydney University, and if they were to know that those very prestigious paths for their kids were closed to them because of their bad behaviour, why not?
Thank you. Now, I see in the front row a distinguished former foreign minister of this country, in fact, the first free foreign minister after the change, Geza Jasinski, is raising his hand.
Prime Minister, thank you very much for this excellent, very exciting and very convincing presentation. 3 years ago, through the good offices of John O'Sullivan, I had the good luck to visit Australia, to revisit, and I had the honour to meet you briefly. And my question is connected with my experiences in Australia. But first of all, I would like to not only welcome your very convincing position, but also that you put an emphasis, it is not enough to protect the borders of Europe, but also to think how to prevent mass migration and how to help those poor masses in Africa and Asia not to feel induced and compelled to escape, but to help these countries to develop and certainly not to have war, and so as Europe can remain the country of, or a continent of the Europeans and Africa of the Africans. But as to Australia's, I think very commendable policy, let me say that in the late 60s, my doctoral dissertation was on the so-called colonial question in the First World War and at the Paris Peace Conference. And I read quite a lot about Australia's position then. I remember reading the Melbourne Age, saying that, well, Australia is an empty continent, and obviously the allusion was that Japan and other Asian countries threaten this continent. Now, on my visit, to some degree, I was surprised to find how large a non-white, non-European community lives there, obviously successfully. Actually, the lady who met me at Sydney Airport was obviously a Japanese, probably Australian citizen. So my question is, if, as far as possible, to tell us the miracle, how you managed to integrate those Asian peoples. I am sorry to say that Europe is not very successful in integrating Muslims, integrating non-Europeans, but Australia is. So I think Europe must learn not only from your policy towards immigration, but also your policy about integration. Thank you.
Okay, well, Excellency, thank you for being here, and thank you for that, I think, very perceptive observation and question, and thank you for the work you did as Hungary's first free foreign minister of modern times, so thank you. But look, because we are an immigrant society, and with the partial exception of Britain, none of the countries of Europe really are immigrant societies. We have a kind of an open mindset when it comes to immigrants. If a couple of generations back you were yourself an immigrant, possibly from a non-English speaking background, you are instinctively going to sympathise with others in the same...
You said, oh, we were a country of immigrants.
How many centuries ago was that? Yes, exactly right. So you've had 1,000 years of relatively settled existence, at least when it comes to people movement. But we've been a country in flux, as it were, from the word go. I mean, our institutions have remained constant, but our ethnic composition has constantly been changing since 1788. So I think that's the first point to make. Your history does make some things easier. It might make other things harder, but I think history makes integration easier for us than maybe for some other countries. And that's just a fact, and I don't think we should hold it against the other countries that we are better at this because of our history than they might be. The other thing that matters is the attitude with which people come. Now, the vast majority of migrants to Australia came not to change us but to join us. Whether they were the British or the Irish coming in our first 100 years, whether it was the Eastern Europeans, the Greeks and the Italians coming after the Second World War, they were all coming not to change us but to join us. And sure, they did change us, but they invariably changed us for the better. We became more sophisticated, more cosmopolitan, our artistic life became better developed, etc., etc. The problem with the people who've been swarming across the borders of Europe in very recent times is that you don't get any impression that they've come to join, you get the impression that they've come to change. I mean, when you get 1 million angry military-age males swarming into a single country in a year, they're not there to be grateful. They're there with a grievance, and people who come with a grievance are very different to people who come with gratitude in their hearts.
Thank you. And in that row, same row, Nick Thorpe and the gentleman at the... Yes, you first and then Nick, I think.
Hi, Philip Blond. Hi. Couple of questions related, building, Tony, on what you were saying. What opportunities are there to have a values-based approach to migration for the major countries, a sort of a values affinity approach, rather than all people and all cultures are equal? When given that we know some cultures integrate better than other cultures, and we know that very clearly, what scope is there to break that taboo and start to talking about cultures that can successfully integrate versus cultures that can't, and making those type of, not racial, but values-based discriminations in the immigration policy of the future?
Okay, look,
And
that's...
also, perhaps I could take a second question too from Nick here. The same row, yes. You can answer both.
Oh, okay.
My name is Nick Thorpe. I'm the BBC Central Europe correspondent, but I'm asking this question as the author of a book on refugee issues in Europe in the last 4 years, The Road Before Me Weeps. I remain unconvinced, I have to say, with all due respect, by any of your arguments. But I would, without asking John for an hour to challenge each of them in turn, I would just like to challenge you on 4 points, very briefly. One is this use of the word uncontrolled and the use of the word swarming. Uncontrolled, there's nothing uncontrolled about migration in Europe today. Certainly there's an enormous amount of control at many borders from many intelligence services, as as we've seen recently, the successful intervention at the Hungarian airport of a suspected ISIS militant. This is how security services and controls actually work very effectively, rather than with massive fences. So and this word swarming is also, it verges on racism, I'm afraid, because it's a word that we use about vermin and insects, not about human beings. My second point would be two words that you didn't mention in your presentation were Nauru and Manus, the actual names of the islands where Australia, in what you, as an architect of it, clearly see as a successful policy, dumped those people in indefinite detention for years. And it actually took the courts of Australia and the intervention of doctors and many civil-minded people, national people full of national pride for their own image of Australia, to manage to overturn that policy in October last year, at least in the case of families. And finally, John, surely rather than NGOs pushing, siding with these wicked smugglers that they speak of, and none of us likes the smugglers and their business model, surely it's governments with their very tough anti-immigration policies, as we saw at the Hungarian border, as we're seeing in Libya today, which are actually siding with the smugglers by giving the people no chance to apply legally for our countries, actually pushing them into the hands of the smugglers, whether it's across the Sahara Desert, across the Mediterranean Sea. There would be a final point about Indonesia. There are only 14,000 refugee asylum seekers in Indonesia today. Surely a concrete policy, and perhaps one we could agree on, might be currently, as in Jordan, as in parts of Turkey, asylum seekers are not allowed to work at the moment. Surely by giving the 14,000, relatively small number of asylum seekers in Indonesia today, the opportunity to work in Indonesia, there would be less pressure. Thank you very much.
Okay, well look, thank you for asking the question in a very polite and civil way, because plainly you do disagree completely with my position. Not only that, you think my position is immoral and wrong. So thank you for being polite. I mean, one of the difficulties at the present time is that we are disagreeing more and we are disagreeing worse. We need to be able to have more civil disagreements than we seem to be able to manage everywhere these days. And all too often, particularly if I may say so on the left, if you don't agree with someone, that person is not just wrong, but they're bad as well. I accept that people of goodwill can disagree, even very intensely, on things without being bad people. I got to tell you, the question sounded more like one from an advocate than from a reporter. And I think this is one of the problems. I think the ABC has this problem. I think the BBC has this problem. Too much advocacy and not enough reporting. Now, just if I could take your main point, which was my use of the term uncontrolled migration. If anyone can rock up in Libya, Morocco, Indonesia, make contact with a people smuggler, a criminal, get on a boat, which the Moroccan government, the Libyan government, such as it is, has no say over, the Indonesian government has no say over, set sail for another country without any permission, without any documents, without any visas, that is uncontrolled migration. I mean, what does our language mean if that is not completely uncontrolled? So look.
Well, hang on a second. Let the speaker finish.
Anyway, now let's get to the other one. Now, I'm very. Look, I hear what you're saying, and I think I know the point that you're making, and I'm not without sympathy for the position. I think the problem is that we can very easily stray from what is a legitimate argument about integration into a darker place, if you like, which is about people's superiority or inferiority. And I just think we have to be very careful about going into that territory. I'm very conscious of the fact that people have come to Australia from just about every country on earth, from just about every culture on earth, and 99.9% of them have turned out to be wonderful Australians. Yeah, sure, some of them don't speak the language that well for the first few years that they're here. Some of them, I guess, always have a different accent in every sense, but invariably it is, on balance, an improvement, not a problem. So I just think that if we are going to start thinking about how do we ensure that people best join our team and make a contribution from day one, we've got to try as far as we humanly can to have objective as opposed to subjective measures. And frankly, the best way to ensure that if someone comes and is a net benefit to society from day one, best way to ensure that is if they've got a job from day one, they're paying taxes from day one, they're integrating with their workmates from day one. And if you've got an immigration system that is firmly founded on people's ability to get a job from day one at a decent wage, so they're not undercutting any local's wage, I think that's the best way forward for all of us.
Just to come back, if I may, isn't that the argument that lay behind, thank you, isn't that the argument that lay behind something that became known as multiculturalism? The failure to deal with values integration and the idea we can ignore it if we just have kind of economic criteria has led precisely to the type of extreme divergencies you see in countries like France. So it's a way of avoiding the issue that I think is no longer sustainable. Because unless you make values discriminations, you're in trouble. Oh yeah, sorry.
We could give it to
but look, there were really
Frank.
two different forms of multiculturalism as practiced in Australia. One was, if you like, a hard form that was pushed, if I may say so, by the left, which more or less encouraged people to come to Australia and not to fit in. And the other, the soft, benign, and I think absolutely acceptable, even right form, was to say to people, look, we know you're going to fit in. You didn't come here to stand out. You came here to fit in. Do it in your own way, at your own pace, in your own time. We're happy with that because we are very confident in the gravitational pull of the Australian way of life. It got you here in the first place, and it will continue to get you in now that you're here.
Thank you. Frank, and then...
Really, as a sociologist, I find it quite curious that anybody could question the reality of uncontrolled immigration. I mean, whatever you think about it, there's an inner dynamic at the moment that everybody recognizes who knows anything about demography, that there is an inherent tendency for people from some parts of the world to move into other parts. That's uncontrolled migration, and you don't need a PhD. In demography to actually grasp that very simple fact of life that an 8-year-old ought to be able to understand. The question I was, which does worry me about Australia, is this. We talked about how in Europe we discovered there is this lack of confidence in the European way of life, and you're absolutely right. There's a real element of guilt and self-loathing about who we are. But I find that when I go to Australia, the similar cultural pattern also exists there. It's particularly strong in places like Sydney and in New South Wales, Melbourne. But not only is it there, but I go to an Australian university, and the Australian university system is probably the most politically correct university system bar Canada. I mean, they're two in a class of their own. And when you talk to a lot of people, academics and people in certain milieux, they talk about Australian history as an irredeemable, negative story of all the bad things that you guys did to everybody else. They want to rewrite Australian culture because everything is the bad old days in Australia. So the question I want to ask you is, aren't you worried about the fact that within Australia, the very same cultural tendencies, in my eyes at least, are pretty deeply entrenched, certainly in the big urban areas?
Well, the short answer is yes. I agree with your analysis. We suffer from the same cultural issues, perhaps to a lesser extent in some ways, perhaps to a greater extent in other ways. And I very much fear that the next Australian government of the centre-left will inevitably water down strong border protection policies, and tragically, I suspect the boats will start and the deaths will start again. And then a subsequent government of the centre-right will need to put strong border protection policies back in place, and it will be harder to do. It'll be even harder to do next time round than it was last time round, which was harder than the time before.
Thank you.
What about the gentleman with the white shirt who's been very eager to have
There's
it?
about 3 questions, and there's a young lady there. I'd like to take these 3 questions one in a row. The young lady there. The gentleman at the back with his hand raised after her.
Thank you so much. My name is Valeria Horvat. I'm a researcher in migration studies, and thank you for that speech. That was very invigorating and interesting. And first of all, a very short comment. In migration studies, we usually start off by saying that migration and migrants don't operate in a vacuum, and there are in migration theory we distinguish push and pull factors. And I think that you've been praised to, for example, conclude free trade agreements, which is the cornerstone of globalization, and such. Measures as such are exactly the factors that induce migration. If you go to a different...
We have a few minutes. We have 3
okay.
2 other speakers.
So, push and pull factors, just that. And my question is actually related to climate change, which you've mentioned as a political strategy of the evil left. But maybe you agree that it is happening, and especially the Pacific is very much affected. And as such, the small island states around Australia are affected. And New Zealand has a very progressive stance.
I must ask you to finish at this point, because you've raised the question of climate change. I'm sure Tony will be happy to answer it. Then I'd like to go to the gentleman in the hall doorway, and the gentleman with his hand raised on the left.
I'll get there, promise.
Yes, the gentleman there.
Thank you very much. I'm Stefan Bos. I'm a correspondent for ABC News Online and also some other media. My question is actually, did the Hungarian government sought your advice on migration? Also, do you think that the Australian and the Hungarian migration model should be, in fact, the model for the European Union? And finally, what do you expect from the summit tomorrow?
Thank you. And finally, the gentleman whose hand raised over there.
Thank you very much. I have a question, no comment. My name is Sándor Földvári. I'm a historian, Hungarian historian, and I'm representing here the Ukrainian Academy too, as far as I'm a member of an editorial board of a history journal in Ukraine. And my question concerns the salary of the immigrant, because as far as I studied your biography, Mr. Abbott, you worked as Minister of Workplace Relations and Employment Minister too. And we have a question in Hungary and Poland too, that about 1 or 3 millions of Ukrainian workers are working in Poland as immigrant workers legally for lower salary as domestic Polish worker. And nowadays in Hungary, about 500,000 Ukrainian immigrants are working legally in Hungary, and some political forces are criticizing that they may work for lower salary. But as an expert of Ukrainian thing, because I'm graduated from Ukrainian philology, and I'm finishing my question, in the case when a worker is coming from a poor country and working in a richer country for a low salary, it's a good business. What is your opinion about this situation? Thank you.
Well, I think our first duty is to our own people. Doesn't mean we haven't got duties to other people as well, but our first and highest duty is to our own people. And I would be very concerned about an immigration policy that was undercutting the wages of Australian workers. And if when people come to Australia to work, they should work at the standard wage for that particular position or higher. They certainly shouldn't come in as, if you like, a form of well, I don't want to use the term slave labour, but they certainly shouldn't come in to undercut wage rates. I don't know what's happening in Poland, but if it is as you say, I think it's a problem, and I can understand why people, both in the Ukraine and in Poland, would be unhappy about it. Now, the ABC. Look, it's not normally my style to give advice as such to other governments. I mean, if other governments wish to talk to me, my style is to politely tell them what I think, and they then normally politely tell me what they think, and sometimes there's a meeting of minds, sometimes there's not. I do think on border protection, the Hungarian government and the current Australian government are largely ad idem, and that's a pretty good thing. Now, on the issue of migration and climate change, look, this is obviously a very contentious subject between the political left and the political right. I have always said that climate change is real. I mean, the ice ages, that was climate change big time. The Roman warming period, that was climate change of sorts. The medieval warm period was climate change of sorts. They had agriculture in Greenland. The mini ice age was climate change. That's when you could ice skate on the Thames for about 100 years in winter. So there's no doubt that climate change is real. The question is, how much impact do we humans make? And I think the jury is still out as to how much impact we make and how important carbon dioxide is in the overall climatic pattern. Certainly, my position in opposition, in government, now as a private citizen, is that we should do everything we reasonably can to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions, but I've never been of the view that we should impoverish ourselves in that cause. And I think one of the problems at the moment is that countries like Australia, like Britain, like the EU, are doing a whole lot of things to reduce their emissions, which aren't going to make any difference to global emissions, because India and China are emitting away to their heart's content. And why wouldn't they? Because if they're going to give their people a better life, and that's their first responsibility, that's what their people want above all else, you've got to give them more energy. And by far, the most affordable, reliable form of energy is from fossil fuels. Now, I think we'll know that the climate activists are fair income when they start advocating for nuclear power, because that is the only reliable form of emissions-free baseload power. But I don't see too many of them putting their hands up for a nuclear power station.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have gone over by about 3 minutes, and about half of your questions have had to remain unanswered.
But could I say, John, before I finish, and sorry, this is obviously a pretty nifty place, this Danube Institute, because you've had a very good crowd turn up. It's been a very lively discussion, and I have to say that while I think I gave a good account of myself, plainly there are people in this audience who don't agree with me, and I think they gave a pretty good account of themselves too.
Well, thank you very much. But as I say, we're finishing now, but you're hanging around for about 25 minutes at the reception, so those of you who didn't get your questions answered may be able to do so in the informal reception that immediately follows. Having said which, and I'd like to thank all of you for being a lively audience, perhaps too lively at times from my standpoint, but there we are. But I'd particularly obviously like to thank Mark.
John, we have a very brief presentation.
We have a small presentation, yes.
Yeah. Would like to give you, my name is István Szabadföldi, the president of Budapest International Business Center Association. Just would like to give you a t-shirt of Hungary and Budapest.
Oh, wow.
And the short story is that I would like to show another one, this one, with Australia. And the short story is that two of my roommates from the university actually living in Australia, Hungarian guys. One of them in Brisbane, the other one is in Sydney. They fled Hungary during the communist time in 1986, and they got asylum in Australia. We were, three of us, members of the democratic opposition. We were under the surveillance of the communist secret service, so they fled right after they were graduated. And I think that this is just a kind of present for the Australian receiving attitude, you know, for those Hungarians who fled the country and were forced to go there and got a new home. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And for the third time, it's my duty to thank Mark Higgy, Gregor Chava, and you, Tony, for a marvellous discussion, a lively debate, and a very powerful presentation of an argument which, though controversial, seemed quite convincing to me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, mate. Thanks, Gabor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll see you actually.